David, if we go back to like the early days, you were talking about your time at Esalen and all of the people who were there. Like when you think back to those days compared to like where we're at now, like are you surprised that we've gotten to where we are right now? When you think back of at what you've lived through.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm very much surprised. Um, you know, when I proposed the Hefter Institute back in not late in the early 90s, Ann Shulgin and Sasha were friends of mine, and Ann said, Dave, the government will never let you do research in psychedelics. I said, why? Just because when people take them, they see the games that the government's playing, da 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 da. I said, well, I just don't believe that. I think it's just a question of qualified people who haven't been in the field and there hasn't been money to fund it. And so I got a lot of pushback from people in the beginning. And when we started the Hefter Institute, I saw a woman a few years ago who she and her husband were one of the early donors to Hefter. They gave $10,000. He was a real estate developer, I think in San Diego. And I saw her at a reception a few years ago and I says, do you remember way back when and you guys gave me $10,000? And she said, oh yeah, oh yeah. I said, do you remember what your husband said? And she looked at me real funny. He said, nobody can ever know where this money came from. And she started laughing. She said, isn't that something? It's changed so much. I mean, I was, I never thought this would happen. Not in my lifetime. A woman asked me some years ago, she said, what do you see as the future for all this? And I said, well, someday, probably long after I'm dead, you'll be having a midlife crisis and you'll go in and you'll see your doctor and he'll send you down to a shaman/psychiatrist at the corner who will give you a session with a psychedelic and give you a new perspective on your life. And she says, oh my God, do you think you'll be dead by then? I said, probably, but if the vector's pointing in the right direction, that'll be okay. But I never imagined it just took off. It's just there's so much interest.
Mhm. And
I started I save reprints. I send Chuck will tell you, I see a reprint I send to him. I started saving reprints on my computer and I can't keep up anymore. I have 4,000 reprints on psychedelics in my computer now, and there's a dozen I haven't even logged in yet.
mhm. um, I talked to Dennis McKenna a few months ago on the podcast. When you were at Esalen in the 80s and around that time period, did you ever meet Terrence McKenna?
I met him once, and I was actually at someone's house prior to taking off, and we were going to go to Essen. And Terence came in, and he was early. I was early. I was staying with someone, so I was there. And he came and sat down, and I looked at him. I said, Terence, the thing that's puzzling to me is, he had the theory that the mushrooms were sort of an alien intelligence that came down. And I think the thing that's really strange to me is that these alien mushroom intelligences have come down and made their home in shit because they're copper. He broke out laughing. He broke out laughing. And then in the big room in Esalen, he rolled a bunch of joints, and there were four of us or five of us sitting in a circle, and he was there at the head. He was rolling his joints up, and God knows what he put in. I think he powdered some hashish and put into it. So he was passing around, and people were just taking a token. I was sitting on his left. I guess I was next to him on left, and there was one around the other side, and I took one toke. And what he was smoking was really dynamite. And so he passed it around a second time. And it came to me, and I said, I'm going to pass. He looked at me really funny. And then it passed around again, and everybody then said, that's enough, that's enough. He says, what a bunch of babies. And in that, the way Terence talked. And he had rolled four joints. He proceeded to smoke the other three. And, nobody, I mean, his ability to smoke dope was legendary.
So what do you guys think have you followed at all so there's a lot of interesting work being done right now and a little bit of controversy and debate over how exactly this piece of the puzzle works. And that's the relationship between classic psychedelics and some of the other drugs that are adjacent to them and neuroplasticity. So a lot of people talk about 2A receptor agonists being able to promote hyperplasticity. Then you've got sort of Gould-Dolan and people over there talking about metaplasticity, and they're not really promoting hyperplasticity. They're changing how easily plasticity can be induced by things like experience. Have you guys been following like that area of the field at all? And what do you make about the idea that psychedelics are promoting hyperplasticity in the brain?
Yeah, we found that over 10 years ago in our lab with LSD in the rat brain and fly brains, and um, so there is a lot of plasticity that is induced. I think was Brian Roth all the way back in 2009 has that paper. So it's been known for a long time that psychedelics do induce plasticity, but so do a lot of other things like methamphetamine and
Mm-hmm.
cocaine. Um, so one of the things that we've been looking at in my lab is the potential functional plasticity rather than the structural plasticity. And that's some unpublished data that we have that 100 days in our rat model after we give a single injection of psilocybin, we see these profound changes in the functional plasticity of the medial prefrontal cortex. We see a hypopolarization of the mean resting potential. We see significantly increased firing rates. So the neurons in the MPFC in our models are firing more. They're more easily fired. And this is 3 some months after a single dose. So we went in with this with the hypothesis, well, let's investigate if it is structural plasticity. We would expect to see genes for synapses to be increased, PSD95, SP2A, synapsin. And when we looked in several areas of the hippocampus and the medial prefrontal cortex, we just didn't see any evidence of that. So my current theory is that there is this increase in structural plasticity that other groups and we have seen. It's induced by ketamine, induced by psilocybin. But the difference is we think that it prunes back to a baseline level after a few weeks. Whereas in the case of ketamine, the behavior reverts back to the depressive-like behavior. But for psilocybin and other psychedelics, there's an epigenetic change which is occurring to upregulate certain ion channels to make them more conductant. So you're pruning back to the same number of synapses, but the ones that are left are more efficient. And
I
so
see.
what we're doing now is we are looking at different channel subunits at these time points, looking for epigenetic factors to see if maybe there is this sort of window of hyperplasticity that then prunes back down to more functional plasticity.
Mm-hmm. And to help people understand what you're talking about here, can you just define explicitly what's the difference between structural and functional plasticity?
So structural would be like the number of dendritic spines. So a lot of people have been giving LSD to neurons in a dish or other psychedelics and just counting how many connections there are between the axon and the dendrite. And there's a certain density. So what we've seen is that there's a nice, robust 15 to 20% increase in the actual physical number of connections between neurons in specific circuits, both in a petri dish and in the real living brain. Those effects, there have been a couple people who have looked sort of long-term in a couple different models. But the persistence of those, if you think about it, it takes a lot of energy to maintain 20% more connections in your brain. And you want to go back to homeostasis. So it makes a little bit more sense to me that you might want to make those new connections in this critical window of plasticity, but then prune things back in the case of psychedelics to where now you've strengthened the relevant connections with ion channels that are more conductant. So you're making those connections that are there more efficient.
Yeah.
And so you're maintaining this antidepressant-like state over the long term.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas for something like ketamine, maybe that doesn't happen.
I see. Yeah, I mean, roughly speaking, it kind of sounds like Gould Dolan's idea, which is that some of these psychedelics are inducing states of metaplasticity, and it's akin to reopening, the critical periods that happen normally, naturally across development, where you've got these windows where things are heightened, and you actually make more synapses than you need, but then there's this sort of pruning process to get rid of the extraneous ones.
Right. At a rough level, I think we are in agreement at that I think there's this sort of maybe 2 to 4 week period where there are more synapses. And we have shown in some of our early work that we published, I think 4 years ago, that the environment that we put a rat in the first week after we give it psilocybin really profoundly shapes what that antidepressant anxiolytic effect is 5 weeks later. That
I see.
if we take a rat, we give it psilocybin, and we expose it to a stressor within that first week, that we believe it develops better coping skills. So when we test it in an elevated plus maze, for example, for anti-anxiety effects, there's a profound anxiolytic effect of a psychedelic when it's stressed and then rescued from that stress. It just learns to, I think, better. It learns better coping skills, that if it just rests and doesn't try to escape, then it will get rescued. Whereas if we don't give it that stressor over the first week, if we wait to the second week or the third week, we don't have any anxiolytic effect that we can detect from that psychedelic 5 weeks. So there is something about the immediate week or so afterwards that tunes the brain to allow it to somehow, I think, mature into a more healthy state.
Hmm. And what were you saying there about differences between psilocybin and ketamine?
So ketamine, when we do them in a side-by-side comparison, both are believed to induce the plasticity through a convergent mechanism through mTOR and BDNF.
Hmm.
But the effects of ketamine in humans and in animal models wear off after about 2 weeks.
Hmm.
And we have seen that. Other people have seen it in human therapy. You have to go back for repeat treatments for ketamine. They don't last for 4 years, as in the case of some studies with psilocybin have shown. So there's a fundamental difference in something beyond just this convergent glutamatergic mechanism inducing BDNF and plasticity, where psychedelics have the capacity to maintain whatever that therapeutic effect is, whereas for ketamine, you're back to a baseline depressed state within a week or two. And so
Yeah.
that's some of what we're trying to do in the lab now, is look at these longer, later time points and identify what those changes are.
I see that. Yeah, I've heard that before. That ketamine's antidepressant-like effects are not as robust and don't last as long as things like psilocybin. So is that a pretty reproducible finding?
Right. Yeah. Several laboratories have shown that ketamine wears off very
Is
quickly.
that like I've seen? I live in Seattle, but I've seen these in a number of cities. But I see these ketamine clinics all over the place now. What I mean, are you guys seeing that too? Is there any? Do you have any concern about how common those types of clinics are becoming?
It is concerning because it's really off-label use for a lot of ketamine. It's just somebody who has a strip mall clinic come in, give them their injections. And I think one of the reasons for that was that there was really kind of no medical billing code and insurance reimbursement. But I think they had a medical billing code a few months ago that was released, and insurance is now starting to reimburse more. And that's going to, I think, have more qualified physicians who have been through that training to use. The only FDA approved use of ketamine now is Spravato, which is the nasal spray for depression. Everything else is really experimental or off label, and it's unregulated.